the Minnesota Vikings put up another embarrassing performance to finish off the season. And in totality, they had 4 losses this year against the same 2 teams. They lose to the Rams and the Lions in the regular season, back-to-back games, and they finish losing to the Lions and Rams to finish out the year. That is classic Minnesota Vikings. And we're going to dive into everything that we saw. I got a page full of notes from this implosion by the Minnesota Vikings. And there's so much to talk about, so many storylines to touch on, because the Minnesota Vikings were 14-3. They more than doubled their win projection from betting sites. And yet they finish the season in a terrible fashion. And like I said, we're going to touch on it all here. So let's just go ahead and get into it. Sam Darnold. I don't think I've ever seen a stock drop so fast from an NFL player like this before. Darnold's stock was low before the year began. Goes 35 touchdowns, 12 picks. Completely changes the trajectory. Spot Track had him on like a $54 million per year deal following this season just a few days ago. And now following his performance against the Lions and his performance against the Rams, this guy's going to be lucky to get a 3-year deal from the Giants or Raiders. Sam Darnold has completely imploded. And those regular season numbers that he put up that were so spectacular, the throw that he put on Justin Jefferson versus the Seattle Seahawks, all of those things are going to go by the wayside because of what he did in the final 2 weeks of the year. He's still going to get paid a decent amount of money, but the fact that he's going to get $100 million guaranteed or $150 million guaranteed, kiss that out the window. Darnold easily lost $30 to $40 million in totality because of the way he played these final 2 games for the Minnesota Vikings. And think about this. Darnold was sacked 9 times. And he was sacked 9 times, which ties an NFL postseason record. Darnold is responsible for most of those sacks. And he was responsible for holding on to the ball too long. Darnold was not seeing things clearly. He once upon a time talking about seeing ghosts when he was with the New York Jets. And that's exactly what we saw from Sam Darnold versus the Lions and versus the Rams. The dude completely choked when it mattered most. You think about the interception to Jordan Addison. He was the attempted receiver on the play. Naylor's streaking wide open down the middle of the field. You think about the strip sack fumble, and that play was ruined from the beginning. The play clock was winding down. Guys weren't in the right formation. It was completely chaotic from the get-go. Darnold gets the snap off, and it was just utter chaos right away. He holds on to the ball too long, which was the story of the game, and loses the ball. Rams go up 17-3. There were so many moments in this game where if the Minnesota Vikings could have just put something together, this could have been a competitive football game. And instead, everything went against the Minnesota Vikings. And it wasn't unlucky. It wasn't poor circumstance. It wasn't rigged. The Minnesota Vikings failed to make plays offensively and defensively when they needed to. And the Minnesota Vikings are solely responsible for this loss. Sam Darnold's stock has dropped. his stock has dropped so fast that Pelosi wasn't even able to sell it in time. Darnold's stock has crashed, and it has crashed so hard that I think Dick from Having Fun with Dick and Jane is over there on a television screen telling everyone how valuable Sam Darnold is right now. This was a piss poor performance from Darnold on all fronts. Missing receivers wide open, holding on to the ball too long, and even on the touchdown drive to Hawkinson, Naylor, and I think there was even another one, bailed Darnold out because every throw was behind the open wide receiver. Darnold could not put anything together in this football game. And there's no doubt that the Minnesota Vikings are going to be looking towards J.J. McCarthy. And, the idea of franchise tagging Sam Darnold looked wonderful once upon a time. 1 year, $41 million, bringing this guy back to see if he can duplicate what he did with the Minnesota Vikings this year. Scratch that, throw that out the window, because you're not paying this guy $41 million a year on a 1-year deal for those two performances that he put up in the most crucial parts of the season. And just to contrast Sam Darnold's performance, look at what Matthew Stafford did. And, his numbers aren't special. 19 for 27, 209 yards, 2 touchdowns, 0 picks, a passer rating of 117.7. Good numbers, not special numbers. But what you saw from Matthew Stafford in this game was a quarterback that was getting rid of the ball on time and on target. It was 3-step drop and throw. Darnold was 3-step drop, pump, hesitate, pump, move a little bit, sack. You can't do that in playoff football. You can't do that with a young Los Angeles Rams defensive front that was sacking him in the entire game. You saw 0 adjustments from Sam Darnold and from the Minnesota Vikings offense in this football game. And right now, you pull up X, and Kevin O'Connell is getting ripped. O'Connell is getting hammered right now. And he's going to be the coach of the year. But you think about O'Connell and his run with the Vikings. He is a brilliant head coach. And the Minnesota Vikings will resign him to a contract extension. And they should resign him to a contract extension. His first year, 13-4, lost to the Giants. Second year, injuries happened. Scratch that year. Third year, 14-3 with Darnold. And then you get blown out in embarrassing fashion versus a Los Angeles Rams team that's going through chaos in Los Angeles, and you got blown out on a neutral field in a game where both the LA Rams and the Minnesota Vikings offenses were doing silent counts. You could look at the quarterbacks and you could look at the way they were communicating with the offensive line. And this was as neutral a sight as an NFL game could ever get. Because you heard Minnesota Vikings fans boo, and you heard Los Angeles Rams fans boo. This was a mix of Vikings and Rams fans. And DraftKings had the Vikings favored by 2.5, which went up 1.5 points when the game got moved to Arizona. But O'Connell's regular season success has not translated into a playoff success yet. And he deserves criticism because the Minnesota Vikings offense was not ready to play versus the Detroit Lions or versus the Los Angeles Rams. And adjustments weren't made for Sam Darnold. And Darnold, I will say, is largely responsible for the Vikings' offensive woes. His incompletions, is holding on to the ball too long. The dude crumbled when it mattered most. But O'Connell certainly deserves his fair share of criticism. And you think about Darnold's stock going down $30 to $40 million perhaps. And O'Connell's stock is going down too. The Vikings will still retain him as head coach. They'll still do the media tour where they talk about how great of a coach he is. But there's no doubt that his number is not as high as it could have been if he took Darnold to the NFC Championship game. Because now this is 2 years out of 3 that your team won at least 13 games in the regular season and 0 wins when it matters most. Troy Aikman had a great quote in the football game. He's like, when you have games like this and you have a 14-3 record, it basically means nothing. The 14-3 record basically means nothing. And how true is that? The Vikings record, regular season, could have been 10-7, wild card team, make the playoffs, lose first round, same thing. The 14-3 record is practically meaningless at this point in time because they just got rocked against the Los Angeles Rams. And you think about the expectations, and there's a lot of just be happy that the Vikings made it this far, people out there. Just be happy. Just be positive. They were only supposed to win 6.5 games. They were only supposed to win 6 or 7 games. That was the betting line, 6.5 games before the season started. But the Minnesota Vikings changed expectations based on how they played and performed this season. So the expectations didn't become, let's just be happy to make the playoffs. The expectations became, they're legitimate Super Bowl contenders. And all season long, I rode this idea that the Vikings weren't. And then at the end of the year, when the Vikings were riding an 8-game winning streak, I finally got sold on them. And then what happens? They put up a lousy performance against the Lions and a lousy performance against the Rams. And I predicted the Vikings to lose this game. I actually predicted Rams 27-24. And I got the Rams score right. But the Minnesota Vikings offense was pitiful. From Sam Darnold to the offensive line to the rushing attack, everything was awful. Aaron Jones, 13 carries, 48 yards. Cam Akers, 5 carries, 39 yards. Darnold, 4 carries, 19 yards. Darnold was sacked 9 times and lost 82 yards in those sacks. 25 for 40, 245 yards. You think about the future of Darnold, and it certainly does not seem like it's a possibility that he will be returning in a Minnesota Vikings uniform next season, because maybe there will still be a Raiders or Giants that throw him all the money in the world and say, you know what, the last 2 games, people will forget about it. Your first 17 games of the year, 35 touchdowns, 12 picks, were incredible. And we think we can duplicate that. And we think we can be a perennial playoff contender with you as QB1. But it certainly does not seem like it's likely that he will be back with the Minnesota Vikings. Some more talking points as we think about and react to this game. The urgency, another O'Connell point. The urgency in the fourth quarter. A lot of times you see NFL comebacks that are unlikely and crazy. And you always get the player quotes that say, we just never gave up. We just continued to battle every down and every possession. Coach always believes in us and our players in the locker room believe in us, blah, 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 yada, yada, yada. And in this situation, that couldn't be any further from the truth. Because after the Minnesota Vikings did not convert their 2-point conversion, when Darnold threw it to Jefferson at the 2-yard line and he got tackled right away, that game was over. And the Minnesota Vikings acted like it was over. I love how fourth quarter, Vikings are down 18 points. You need to put up points quickly. And that's when the Minnesota Vikings decide to try to involve the rushing attack and remain balanced and keep things unpredictable for the Rams. At that point in time, you are burning clock and you are playing in the favor for the Los Angeles Rams. So the fact that the Vikings were running the ball down 18 showed a lack of any potential belief. It was already a long stretch for the Minnesota Vikings to have any chance of tying that game and going into overtime. And the Minnesota Vikings wiped out any potential long stretch of any chance, of any percentage, to tie that game when they decided to run the ball, not just once in the fourth quarter, but they ran the ball multiple times and killed the clock. And the Rams were thinking from their perspective, this is the best offense we could ever ask for right now. We're sitting playing a preventative defense, trying not to give up a big play, and the Minnesota Vikings are running the ball and burning their own clock. Unbelievable. The lack of urgency just showed so much in that moment. More things to talk about. Remember Jordan Addison's important catch? First quarter. Vikings down 10-0, which I'll get to in a moment. Vikings got the ball. It's like 3rd and 3, 3rd and 4. Darnold finds Addison. And this was an incredible catch by Addison. Somehow he snags the ball out of midair after bobbling it once. He goes to the ground without bobbling it. And I just remember thinking in that moment, what an important catch to keep the Minnesota Vikings in this ball game. They eventually kicked a field goal down 10-3, and things unraveled from there. But just think about that moment. Remember Jordan Addison's big catch in the first quarter? When he kept the Minnesota Vikings alive in this football game? Just shows you how embarrassing it was that catch in the first quarter kept the Minnesota Vikings alive. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. More stories to touch on. Well, one of my favorite stories of the game. Gruger Hill, the Minnesota Vikings special teams player that somehow did not block the punt from the Los Angeles Rams punter. It literally went underneath his shoulder pads. I slowed down the video to 0.5 and watched this thing 10 times. And some way, somehow, I still couldn't believe it. The ball is right there. And somehow Gruger Hill misses. You think about plays that could change the outcome of the game. My game-changing moments segment that I do every football game, whether the Minnesota Vikings win or the Minnesota Vikings lose. And this is one of those moments that's a game-changing moment, because that block could have changed the trajectory of the Minnesota Vikings in this football game. They clearly needed a takeaway of some sort in this game to stay alive and give them any hope or chance of beating the Rams when Sam Darnold was imploding. And this was the moment. This was the chance. And somehow Gruger Hill missed it. It was one of those Madden glitch moments where you literally go to the instant replay. And this is like Madden 2009 on PlayStation 2, where the ball literally goes through the helmet of the defensive player into the wide receiver's hands. That was this moment. The Gruger Hill moment was a Madden glitch. Unbelievable. The Bullard offsides on the LA Rams' first possession. Another game-changing moment. this reminded me of the Minnesota Vikings matchup versus the Green Bay Packers back in, was it 2011, 2012, when Adrian Peterson had the career rushing season and Christian Ponder steps in and has a decent season for the Minnesota Vikings. And Joe Webb gets inserted into the Minnesota Vikings starting lineup because Christian Ponder goes down with an elbow injury. And I'll always remember this is ingrained in my head. The Packers are going for it on like 4th and 1 or 4th and 2. And I think it was Kevin Williams, an all-time Minnesota Vikings defensive tackle, falls for the fake, goes off sides, Packers go down, score a touchdown, and all momentum goes to the Green Bay Packers. Based on how the LA Rams played in this football game, they probably would have got the first down and scored a touchdown regardless. But you've got to make them earn it. A 4th and 1 free first down, a shout out to Everson Griffin. Jonathan Bullard, you cannot fall for that. You cannot fall for the offsides or the fake hike because you're just gifting the Los Angeles Rams a free first down. And who knows what would have happened on that play? And who knows how that one play could have changed or shifted the momentum or the outcome in this football game. And LA Rams score a touchdown, 3 and out, score a field goal, which you think about how bad the refs were, Minnesota Vikings fans will say. And the only reason why the Rams kicked a field goal on that second possession was because the Rams offensive lineman was called for a bogus late block. When the play was still clearly going, the Rams offensive lineman pushed a Minnesota Vikings defensive player over. They throw the 15-yard flag. They kick the field goal. So the Minnesota Vikings were given gifts, and the NFL is not rigged, just for those that needed to hear that on this podcast. The Matthew Stafford controversy. Another big play. Vikings down 10-3. Stafford allegedly fumbles. Blake Cashman picks it up, runs it in the end zone, tied football game. Vikings are back in it. Vikings offense is nowhere to be seen. But this was the moment that the entire team needed for a spark. And the officials call it back. And there was so much argument over this call on X. And the NFL officiating crew got it right. It was not a fumble by Matthew Stafford. And it also was not an intentional grounding. Puka Nacua was in the vicinity of that play. He was right there. And Matthew Stafford shoveled the pass in the direction and in the vicinity of Puka Nacua. And I don't understand why this play was so controversial, because Matthew Stafford had possession of the ball, and it was just like a shovel pass in the NFL. It was a shovel pass to Puka Nacua, but it was an incomplete pass. It's not like he had possession and lost possession of it. It's not like there was some tuck rule play where, because of some weird random ass rule, that this was a fumble or an incomplete pass. And this was the right call. Stafford had complete control of the football. And if he didn't throw the incomplete pass, he would have just taken the sack. But unlike Sam Darnold, the entire game, Matthew Stafford was aware enough and knows how much a sack influences and impacts a drive negatively. So he got rid of the football and kept the Rams' drive alive. That was not a fumble. It was nowhere close to a fumble. And if Sam Darnold did the exact same thing. And the NFL officials called the exact same way. The Minnesota Vikings fans would have reacted and called it a great call. This was a situation where Minnesota Vikings fans were upset because of their own bias towards their football team. And this is where an objective mind like myself helps a lot in this situation. Troy Aikman, Joe Buck, the NFL ESPN officials guy, all of these unbiased, objective dudes agreed that this was not a fumble by Matthew Stafford. He had complete control of the football, and it was not a fumble. He knew what he was doing. And credit Matthew Stafford for making a magical play, because he could have taken a sack, but he didn't. Kept the drive alive, and I don't remember if the Rams scored or what happened, but it was a brilliant play by a veteran quarterback that was prepared for this moment, unlike Sam Darnold. Another point in this game. The 4th and 2, Kevin O'Connell, before halftime, goes for it. Vikings down 17-3. They put a touchdown on the board, 17-10. He gets the ball third quarter to start. Touchdown, 17-17. Tie game. That's what Kevin O'Connell's thinking. And the Minnesota Vikings offense hadn't gotten anything going the entire game. 4th and 2, you give yourself a chance. And, of course, Sam Darnold, I'm sure he took a sack because he took 9 of them. Can't remember all of them, but I think he took a sack on that one. Sam Darnold takes a sack. Of course, he does. That was the right call to go for it. I saw some people debating online whether, he should have punted the ball, go up 17, stay down 17-3 at halftime instead of going down 24-3. There's no guarantee that the Minnesota Vikings are only down 17-3 at halftime if the Minnesota Vikings punt the ball. There's a greater chance that they're only down 17-3 because you pin them down at their own 10 or 5-yard line or whatever. But there's no guarantee that the Rams don't go down the field and kick a field goal or score a touchdown, and the result is similar. It's 4th and 2. A lot of NFL teams can pick up a first down on 4th and 2. Dan Campbell certainly would have went for it. I bet Sean McVay would have went for it if their team was down 14 points, 4th and 2, right before halftime. He tried to get some momentum, some spark going. And late in the game, or third quarter, Darnold, incomplete pass to Naylor, wide open down the middle of the field, threw it about 3 feet behind him, comes 4th and 5. Vikings punt the ball. And the Los Angeles Rams go all the way down the field and kick a field goal. It was the exact same situation. Instead of 4th and 2, it was 4th and 5. The Rams went all the way down the field, burned all that clock, and kicked the field goal. So there's no guaranteeing that the Rams wouldn't have scored if the Minnesota Vikings punted on 4th and 2. I love that play call. I love the aggression because you got to pick up 2 yards. And then you have the final 2 minutes until halftime to score a touchdown. And with Darnold playing as poorly as he was playing, it gives the team an opportunity to create a spark and make something happen. And Darnold, like most of the game, failed. But I like the aggression. I like the play call because the Minnesota Vikings had to do something. They were desperate. And O'Connell showed his desperate play calling or decision making throughout this football game, like the challenge that he threw. Kyren Williams was down by a mile, and he threw the flag anyways, the challenge flag that is, to try to make something happen. And there's just nothing happening. There was nothing happening. This was a full-on implosion by the Minnesota Vikings. And podcast is almost over, but I want to wrap up at this point. After the Packers lost to the Eagles yesterday, I said, hold on. Let's not celebrate too hard this Packers loss until the Minnesota Vikings, if the Minnesota Vikings beat the Rams. Then we've advanced further. Then we can brag about how much further we've gotten than them. And we got Sam Darnold. And now the Minnesota Vikings are in the exact same position as the Packers, except the Vikings got blown out 27-9. And we're favored by 2.5 points to win this game. So that's why you don't celebrate too hard when your divisional rival loses in the playoffs. Because now the Packers can come right back at the Minnesota Vikings fans and say, you know what? Look at you guys. You just got blown out by 18 points. It was an embarrassing game, a full-on crumble by all parties from the Minnesota Vikings. Offensively, defensively, special teams. Tough. Tough. Tough way to go. And a season that once felt so special. And this is what I also learned from this game. Going forward, I am not going to call a season special until I know it's special. Mid-season, I'm like, oh, this season is special. Vikings are 5-0. Here we go. 5-0. Here we go. 14-2. This season is special. The Vikings are going to beat the Lions because this season is special. I learned something this year. The season is not special until you win multiple playoff games. I'm not calling this season special until it proves to be special. And that's what I learned from the Minnesota Vikings season this year. In a situation like the NFL, when you have to win to move on one game, it's not like a 7-game series where it's basketball and the best team always wins. This is one game to advance. And anybody can win. And the Minnesota Vikings just got pounced in their quote-unquote special season. Anyways, thank you for watching. Thank you for making this podcast part of your day. Appreciate you listening. Hit that subscribe button and follow button wherever you're watching and listening to this podcast. Thanks for going on this podcasting journey with me.